His current research is highly related to today's conversation. He researches the economics of renewable energy, economic policies for reducing greenhouse gases, and alternative models of retail electric pricing. Also, in 2019, he was appointed to the Cal ISO Board of Operators. I first heard about Severn in 2002. I was meeting with then Assemblymember Joe Canciamelli, and he said, if you want to know anything about what happens in energy, this is the person you should talk to. At the time, he was advising the governor's office on how to manage Enron and a few other players in the energy sector at that time. So I counted a lot on his research in helping to design and advocate for the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, as well as others. Much to my surprise, a couple of months ago, I asked Severn whether he'd be willing to just look at what we were thinking of doing here. And he took a look and he said, have you thought about using the avoided cost model for doing rates and various advantages? And it really changed my thinking quite a bit. So I've invited him here today to talk a little bit about the overall direction he sees happening, and during our discussion be available to answer some specific questions for the board or the audience. So Severn, thank you so much for helping out the second smallest utility in the state of California, but we think the one that's the most progressive.
Thanks, Bob. I didn't realize it was the second smallest. I've been telling people it's the smallest.
No, that's the town of Big, California.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. As Bob said, I do a lot of work on electricity rate design. And in fact, when Bob contacted me a couple months ago, it was right as we were finishing up work on a report that we put out in February, looking at retail rate design for the big investor-owned utilities in California. And the problems that they face are very similar to the problems that, I'm not sure how you refer to it, KMPUD, or is there a shorter version?
The district.
The district faces. In that the retail rates are very high, volumetric rates are very high, relative to the actual cost imposed when people consume additional electricity. And if we want people to electrify, which is almost certainly going to be the primary road to decarbonization, how do we make that a more attractive option, while at the same time still covering costs? And Bob came to me and showed me the situation the district was in, and it just was a magnification of the problems that the big investor-owned utilities face right now. So I volunteered to talk it through with him and think about alternative ways of dealing with this. The problem's pretty clear. The district faces costs that on average amount to about 70 cents a kilowatt hour, but the actual incremental cost of consuming additional electricity is far, far lower. And in fact, I would argue it's even lower than the avoided cost number that you've been talking about, because it's likely the case that some of these operations and maintenance costs are really not scalable with output. So if each of you used 5% more electricity, I doubt operations and maintenance costs would go up 5%. Or conversely, if you went down, they wouldn't go down that much. But let's take that as the avoided cost number. It doesn't include all of the external impacts on the environment, but it includes most of them probably. There's probably some cost of greenhouse gases that go beyond the REC purchase cost. So those probably about balance out. And I would say that 13, 14 cents a kilowatt hour is probably a reasonable number to be thinking about. What is the full cost to society, including those greenhouse gases, when you use a bit more electricity? Now, economists view that as a very attractive idea to base prices on, because we want to give people the right incentives to consume electricity when they value it more than the cost they're imposing on society. And that's sort of the fundamental concept of market economies, that prices send signals about the costs that your consumption is imposing on society. But if you do that, in this case, you end up with a pretty big revenue shortfall. And so Bob and I talked about, well, how do you collect the rest of that in a way that isn't going to discourage electrification, not just for the houses, but also for vehicles, because we're facing a real need to reduce use of hydrocarbons and fossil fuels. And we're not going to get there if we charge people 30 or 70 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the justification, I think, and I think it's a very strong one for moving volumetric prices to something that reflects the true avoided cost. Now, let me address one concern that comes up often when I talk about that, which is, won't that discourage energy efficiency? And the answer is, to some extent, yes. If you charge people 70 cents a kilowatt hour, they're really going to go out of their way not to use electricity. But some of that is going to be by burning more propane, by burning more wood, by using other fuels. And some of it's just going to be by being uncomfortable, even though the true cost you would be imposing by making yourself more comfortable or being inconvenienced would not be that high. So I think that you certainly encourage more energy efficiency when you charge extremely high rates, but there's a lot of energy efficiency, even at 13 or 14 cents a kilowatt hour, particularly things like lighting, that still makes a lot of sense. I'll just talk briefly about the revenue recovery, and then I'm happy to engage in a conversation. Charging the avoided cost would leave a pretty big revenue shortfall. And so Bob and I talked at a lot of length about how to go about doing that, recovering that money. And there's a real balance here. On the one hand, well, of three different components. One, you would like to do it in a way that isn't causing perverse incentives, that isn't causing people to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise take, just to avoid paying some of those, I'm going to call them fixed costs, because most of them are. So you don't want to give people perverse incentives to not install a new electric heat or something of that sort. On the other hand, you want to recover the money in a way that is generally viewed as equitable. And then there's this third component, which is, from a sort of community point of view, it's likely to be more acceptable if people generally aren't seeing big changes in their bills. So a sort of a status quo value, so that whatever people were doing under the old system, there aren't people who see big changes up or down. And so balancing those three is very, very difficult. I would argue that in many ways, the simplest solution would be just a fixed charge per household, where everybody pays a monthly fee, regardless of how much electricity they use. Remember, this is collecting the component of cost that is unrelated to how much electricity you use. So I think from an equity point of view, it makes a certain amount of sense to say everyone contributes to that equally. From a status quo point of view, that really is not as attractive, because some people would see substantial increases and some people would see substantial decreases. So Bob brought this idea of creating sort of a baseline level on which your monthly fee would be based, that is based on some historical usage. Now, I'll just give you one alternative that we threw out that or we talked about that I think is worth thinking about, which is basing it on the square footage of the building. Saying, again, this isn't that you're imposing higher costs, because the incremental costs are in that 14 cents or 13.7 cents a kilowatt hour. This is sort of just a fairness in the allocation of these fixed costs. And one might argue, well, the fair way to do it is people with bigger houses contribute more. But once you go down that road, you also have to say, well, what about people who don't use their house, who aren't occupying their houses as much? And maybe they shouldn't have to contribute as much. But this is purely an equity argument at this point. It's because we know this is just recovering these extra costs. So after talking that through, Bob suggested this idea of using the EDU construct and basing it on historical usage. In some ways, this really does satisfy a lot of the equity criteria for people when the houses are, if everybody has already lived there for 5 years and nobody ever moves, you're just sort of locking in something that's pretty close to what people were already paying. You're minimizing the variation. And in some sense, it's saying, well, nobody's worse off than if we hadn't made this move. And in some ways, everybody could be a whole lot better off, because you have the same baseline bill, but if you electrify, you now are facing a much lower additional cost of electric heat, electric hot water heating, charging an EV or whatever, and getting off propane. So in some ways, it could make everybody better off. The problem with the EDU construct is that when we go down this road, we start talking about, well, what do we do about new owners, new houses, people make big changes to their houses, so forth. And you're more familiar than I am, if you've been at this meeting, that with the way that the proposal goes to sort of do a roll-in of usage. In some ways, that has some real equity appeal, because it says we're going to base it on your household's use. In some ways, it has some concerns about perverse incentives, that you don't want people not using electricity in the first 3 years in order to keep their EDU down for the rest of their ownership time. So it's a trade-off, and I have gone back and forth on the right way to do this. The sort of economist in me still says, let's just have a fixed charge per household. It's really clean. Nobody can argue that they're being treated differently, and there's no gaming possibility. Even, by the way, doing it on square footage would cause incentives that people might not. It would be one more cost that you would incur if you expanded the size of your house. So nothing's perfect. The fixed charge per household has the problem that some people would see some pretty big increases. And the EDU approach tries to avoid that. So I think it's a balancing. I think the most important aspect of this proposal is getting that volumetric cost down to reflect the true additional cost you're imposing on society when you use more electricity. And let me just make one last point and then I'll stop. Propane as an alternative is underpriced in our society, because propane is sold without, unless you're buying some sort of offsets for it, it is sold without the additional cost of the environmental damage that it does. So we are, in some sense, overly encouraging the use of propane. And that's true of wood too, because wood has, I also served for 5 years on the advisory council of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And wood burning is a major problem. We're learning more and more about the particulate matter, the damage from PM 2.5 that is largely in the Bay Area, and I suspect also around Kirkwood Meadows due to wood burning. So it's not just getting the electricity price right, it's also recognizing that we're underpricing the primary alternative fuel. So I think that covers all of my introductory thoughts anyway, I'd be happy to chat and take questions or engage in a conversation.
Thank you, Severin. Really appreciate that. Very good. I imagine there are some people who would like to ask questions or give thoughts and so on. So the process is to, if you can raise your hand on using Zoom, that's the best way to do it. If not, assuming that that Eric's on gallery view, just waving your hand will probably do the trick as well.
Reed Bennett has a question, Eric.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, well, I'm wondering, I have several different thoughts about it, and I don't know if it's best if I go through them all and then they're addressed, or what do you
Yeah,
suggest?
I think that's the best, Reed, is to list your questions, and
okay.
I think that's most efficient.
So I appreciate the thought and time that you've all put into it, and Professor Borenstein and Bob Epstein and then the board. And I guess for people who don't know, I have had a long background, even though I haven't been recently real active in Kirkwood things, but I've been a long time Rocky Mountain Institute supporter and admirer Amory Lovins. And I supported early on from the very beginning, 20 plus years ago, of Kirkwood connecting with the grid. And I think I'm the first person who suggested getting funding from the Rural Electrification Fund, and suggested this to Standish, and he did a Google search and he left the D off of fund. So he searched Rural Electrification Fund and came up empty-handed. So, so I have, for a long time, I have thought about energy policy, not to the extent of Dr. or Professor Borenstein. I have several concerns about this proposed rate change. I feel that it's overall regressive. What I don't understand is if you have a low marginal cost for electricity, how is that going to be an incentive to reduce consumption? And we could take just one example is that I have an electric water heater and was thinking of going to an on-demand or tankless electric water heater. And right now, right now I'm spending about $30, $35 a month keeping that water heater warm in the winter. And then if we went to the new rate structure, it would be, I don't know, about $7. And if I go to a tankless, it would be $0. So if you have the current rate structure in place, I'm much more inclined to go to a tankless water heater and save myself $30, $35 a month in electricity as compared with, $7 or some number like that. The other thing I'd like to point out is that with the occupancy / consumption much increased the past year, if you had put this proposed rate schedule into effect July 1 of last year, we actually would have led to lower revenues for the district, because the increase in consumption would have been billed at 13 cents a kilowatt rather than the 66. And I think that with people staying up at Kirkwood much more, which is very likely to be the case, there's great internet up there, as my brother from Palo Alto discovered last fall. He said, hey, there's got better internet at Kirkwood than he did in Palo Alto. And so many people are leaving the bigger cities. They don't need to work from home. They don't need to work from the office. They can work from further away, and people rather be in the mountains. And you see it in places like Truckee that is very, very busy now. I'm not, I agree with what Professor Bornstein said about propane being relatively inexpensive. And one thing I would do is, if you want to get people off of propane, if you can, I would suggest charging more for it. That would make sense in my book. And the idea of bringing in electricity where you lose, just within your own system, you're losing what you can look at the numbers. I think it's around 16% from the lower substation and within your system, and you're probably losing at least another 8% getting it to there. So you have a good 23, 25% of transmission loss of electricity. So if you're buying electricity, okay, 35% of it's eco-groovy, and let's pretend there's no environmental impact to that 35%. And the remaining 65% is God knows where it came from. So if you're bringing electricity in that you don't know the source, and it could be just as carbon intensive as a propane heater at someone's house, you're losing that 20-25% in transmission.
So Reed, have you basically covered your point? I'm sorry, there's just a number of people with hands up and so on, so I want to make sure that Severin can answer everybody's questions.
Well, just to summarize, I'd say raise propane rates as you can. Electricity is not necessarily clean. And I have suggestions about energy efficiency where you can really do something to have people have tankless water heaters, be able to turn off electricity and not heat the house where they're gone. And I just see a lot of potential unintended consequences for what's being proposed. And I think what would make more sense is go to tiered rates like PG&E does and charge for higher as you go up in electric rates. And the other thing is, when you have people like the rooters who are leaving and they're going from full-time occupancy to pretty much empty, then they're left with this higher electric rates for the next year when they're not there, and that's not fair.
Great, Reed, thanks so much. Severin, do you want to?
So I took notes, and I'll try to cover a lot of these points because I suspect a lot of them are things other people would raise as well. First of all, the idea of this being regressive, and in a lot of situations it would be, but my understanding is that among the customers of the district, there are some who are full-time occupants, and they tend to be lower income than the people who are occasional occupants. They are almost certainly consuming more electricity right now, and they would be winners under this alternative. So I think actually this is a pretty progressive change, and that isn't true. Like if PG&E went to a flat rate fixed charge that was substantial, that actually would be regressive because it's pretty close now, but poorer households in PG&E territory do use somewhat less electricity. My understanding is that's probably not true in the district. Secondly, the low in marginal cost for electricity and the incentive to reduce consumption and do things like install tankless water heaters. It is true, lowering the marginal cost means that there is less incentive to install something like a tankless water heater, but you're not lowering it to below the true cost you're imposing on society. You're lowering it to actually reflect the cost you're imposing on society. So when people are making that decision, because of course a tankless water heater involves other costs to society, building the tankless water heater and having it installed, and the person time and the resources that go into that. So I think that what we'd like is prices to actually reflect the cost that a decision imposes on society. Right now, at 66 cents a kilowatt hour, it really doesn't. It massively overstates, including all the pollution, the cost you're imposing on society. So I would say that there is such a thing as too much energy efficiency and too little electricity consumption when it comes to the trade-off with all of the other resources and time and inconvenience. And so I don't think we want people installing something like a tankless water heater because they can save money that isn't really a savings. It's just shifting that burden of capital recovery onto other ratepayers. On lower revenues in 2020, that's true. If a lot of people moved to Kirkwood Meadows during the pandemic and used more electricity, presumably revenues went up as a result. But if the opposite happened, revenues would go down. This proposal actually stabilizes revenues at a level that covers the capital costs. It doesn't generate a windfall gain when people use more electricity, and it doesn't generate a windfall loss when people use less electricity, because the cost of people using more electricity is exactly what's reflected in the price. And so, for instance, if a lot of people were to now start spending a lot more time up at Kirkwood Meadows, they would use more electricity, and the revenue would go up by exactly as much as the additional cost that is imposed on the district. And so in some ways, I think this leads to a more balanced or a better balance between revenues and costs. Right now, when charging a price that's massively higher than the avoided cost, when people use more electricity, the district gets this windfall profit. And alternatively, when people use less, they take a windfall loss. I agree with charging more for propane. I think that's probably a very good idea and something the district should look into. Let me address this issue of the efficiency of electricity and the emissions and so forth. First of all, the PG&E right now is supplying about 70% carbon-free electricity. So it's not, the 35% is the RPS, but there's nuclear power, there's hydropower, there's geothermal. And so when you add all that together, PG&E is over 2/3 carbon-free. That said, there is still gas in the system, and there is an inefficiency of, I mean, the biggest difference is for space heating, when you burn gas locally versus when you burn gas at the inefficiency is when you burn gas at the generator. It's not quite as bad as the numbers you raised, Reed. Somebody shared with me an email you sent, and I was just going back to check those numbers. A modern combined cycle gas turbine has a heat rate of about 7,000, meaning about 7 MMBTU for 1 megawatt hour of electricity. And when you do the math on that and take out about 10% losses, and it might be a bit higher, but it's not as high as the number you're coming up with, because you're sort of adding system losses that include distribution to the local distribution. But even when you do that, it's probably about 50% efficient versus 90% efficient for a furnace, let's say, although there are more losses of gas when you're piping it that far. But so there is some difference right now. When you actually work through how much additional greenhouse gases are being emitted, recognizing the system is about 2/3 carbon-free right now, it's not that big right now, though it's probably pretty close to a wash right now. When you recognize that that very often we're using non-carbon electricity to generate that extra amount. But these investments are for the future, and we are moving to, and I think quite credibly moving to, much higher levels of renewables. So I think we will, by 2030, be at 60% renewables, which means we will be at 80+% carbon-free by 2030, and we'll be much higher than that by 2040. So I think that in terms of carbon emissions right now, for some things like space heating, it's probably not much of a gain, but it will be a much bigger gain in 5 or 10 years. And even that, the fact is, it's not just about carbon. It's about making trade-offs with other capital investments, with other inconvenience and time. So charging a price that actually reflects all of that, which I think the avoided cost number Bob's generated does, would make sense. And then the last thing I will say, PG&E is actually moving away from tiered rates. The tiers have gotten much flatter over the last 5 years. And there's some real equity issues with tiered rates because, and you guys, I think if you did this, you would, people who don't use their houses much would be on the low tier, not because they're particularly energy conscious, but because they're just not there very much. People who live there full time would be on high tiers, not because they're particularly wasteful, but because they just live there. So I think it would be very hard to construct a tiered system that's really equitable.
Okay, thanks, Evan. I'd like to go to Howard. Howard, you're on. Howard Hoffman.
Thank you, Severin, for a very excellent presentation and for your responses to the questions. I have just...
Oh, Howard, by the way, I'm sorry, Howard. I didn't mean, I'm sorry for interrupting. I just want to ask everybody to be, completely give your thoughts, but be as brief as you can in doing so.
Yes,
please. Thank you.
I'm planning to ask questions, not make a speech.
Okay, Howard.
Okay, so first of all, I have 3 questions for you. First of all, do you understand and did you discuss with Bob the implications of the fact that this district has one really major consumer, the ski area, and how the whole project, which is the largest part of our sunk cost, was predicated on not only them using a lot of the electricity, but using a lot of the increased electricity going forward? That's the first question. Second question, have you given any thought to some sort of a hybrid or a compromise where we would go from our current very high rate to something closer to the avoided cost, but not necessarily all the way there? And the third question is, what do you think about phasing in? This is a pretty drastic change. What do you think about phasing in whatever change is agreed upon to, in say 3 years or 5 years, something like that?
Sorry, I muted myself. Bob and I have talked about the ski resort and some of the legal constraints on how they can't really be treated differently in some ways that I don't fully understand. I'm not going to claim to. Certainly, if there is a way to have the ski resort cover more of the fixed costs, I think in many ways that would make sense, particularly if it could be done through a fixed charge and not through something. You don't want to give the ski resort undue incentives either to avoid electrification and use propane and so forth. But we haven't really, I haven't learned much about the history of the whole negotiation of the upgrade of the transmission line and so forth, and the role the ski resort was supposed to play. Bob can probably comment on that better than I can.
Yeah, Severin, let me just mention at this point. So for the last 3 years, we've averaged 6.8 million kilowatt hours sold per year. Of that, the snowmaking and lifts are 1.2 million. So it's significant, but in fact, our largest customer is the wastewater treatment plant. So that's one point I'd want to make. The ski resort sees a few percentage point increase because we're using an EDU based on the average residential usage of 230 kilowatt hours per month. And so in fact, this slightly shifts the fixed costs more toward the larger customers and away a little slightly from the residences. It's not a large amount, but it's a tiny amount.
On the hybrid, getting it down to 25 or 20 or some number rather than all the way to 14, that's an alternative, and obviously that's for you folks to work out. It would still I think, discourage electrification to some extent, but certainly not nearly as much as it is now. And if that's what people are more comfortable with, maybe that's where you end up. I would rather see it. I think the 14 cent, 13.7 cents is still too high because we've done calculations for California as a whole, and certainly the marginal cost, avoided cost is lower. I think some of what is in the purchase power price is not actually a marginal cost, is actually recovering a lot of fixed costs. So the cost to society of you using another kilowatt hour is probably lower than that. And as I mentioned, the O&M costs are probably not all marginal. But, you know, I think that even getting it down into the 20s would be a major step in the right direction and would avoid some of the real inefficiencies that these very, very high electricity prices cause. As for a phase-in, you know, I think that can make a lot of sense. There's no reason this has to be done as a one-time, although Bob might, I mean, there may be institutional reasons it's easier. What I would worry about, and I think it would be very important to address if you're going to do a phase-in, is that the baselines or whatever the pricing is going to be at the end of the phase-in is not influenced by the way people change their behavior during the phase-in. So you can't sort of game the system by cutting back a lot during the phase-in so that at the end you have a lower share of the costs. I think that would be a real concern. But, you know, if it were pre-announced that these are everybody's contributions to fixed costs, whether it's done through EDU or square footage or whatever, you know, whatever system, but that, you know, we're setting those, but we're going to do it gradually. Next year, the marginal price will be 50 cents and the EDU price will be X. The following year, it'll be 40 cents and the EDU price will be a little higher. And phasing it in that way might give people more time to get used to it. And Howard, I suspect if you're concerned there might be some sort of unforeseen impact, might give people a chance to recognize that. I actually think just going to the avoided costs is not going to lead to bad unforeseen impacts. I suspect it will lead to one really good unforeseen impact or not fully appreciated, which is when people start thinking about renovations and EVs and so forth, they're going to find it just much more attractive to go with electricity. And the evidence for much smaller changes than this has been that it has a real impact on people's willingness to switch from natural gas or propane or in the East, crude oil or heating oil to electricity, or to alternative fuels. I think a phase-in could be part of the sort of getting to where I think the district should go, and is certainly worth discussing.
Bertrand, I see your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello. Thank you for taking the time to look at our special situation. I mean, we are actually a small district and probably one of the most leveraged percentage-wise district around. And it is clearly a problem. Historically, I'd like also to remind people that when the community was offered this concept of electrification through the grid, the cost was estimated at 30 million and we end up at 60 million. So it is quite a bit different to what we were told initially. It also like to remember that at that time, I'm not sure where the requirement is coming from, if it's through the RUS or somewhere else, but basically no one can opt out of the system. So basically we cannot close our electrical account. And I find that problematic to be considered a free market. But anyway, my main concern here, I have small concern, regular concern, I would say, which are basically the fact it is regressive because, for example, it's always interesting to look at the trends when you go all the way in one direction. For example, if you have zero consumption and you look at a cabin of 7,000 square foot versus a studio of 350 square foot, basically we are going to ask them to contribute as much. However, the will serve capacity, which is really what should be actually taken in consideration, the capacity is actually not taken in consideration by asking everyone to pay the same thing. So I think it's very regressive that people with a very big cabin have to pay the same thing that people that live in a small studio.
Bertrand,
Yes.
if you've got questions for Severin, that would be great.
Yes, I'm moving on my things. Yes. Yeah. So let me get to the next part. My biggest concern is all this calculation and studies that we are showing is basically saying, assuming there will be no change, but I think it's obvious there will be a change. So we need to take the time to assess the impact it's going to have on our system. So one of the considerations I'd like to see is, should we shift to time of use? Do we have a time of use system to make sure that once we have cheap electricity, everyone is getting on electrical car, and then we cannot provide sufficient electricity to the resort to run the ski lift. So that kind of thing that I'd like to be able to see, to discuss. I'd like to see.
Is that a question, Bertrand? Or?
Not yet. Then the next thing is the greenhouse gas effect. And you already mentioned several things. I agree with that. For example, I agree that the propane should probably be charged higher. First, because I think we have infrastructure work to do on it. And second, maybe the REC should be compulsory for having basically proper impact on the environment. I really want, so now as far as question. So how can you, my question is on this regressive thing is, how can you say it is a progressive thing to do when actually the system that is proposed is actually charging the same amount of money for people who have a 350 square foot studio versus a 7,000 square foot cabin? That's the first question.
So, oh, okay. Go ahead with your other question.
No, that's there's more.
Okay.
Bertrand's a board member. He'll have plenty of time to.
So let me address this regressivity. To an economist, and I think in general, the term is used to mean impacting poorer people more than richer people. I'm sure that poorer people, well, I would guess the poorer people in the district own smaller houses, but my understanding is they spend a lot more time there. And my understanding is that the best analysis suggests that they actually use more electricity. So regardless of the size of their house, the impact on lower income people depends on how much electricity they use. And if the lower income people over the course of the whole year are using more electricity, they are going to be bigger winners from this change. There is also, I think it's important to point out, big gains for everyone that relative to when they're charging 67 cents or 65 cents and avoiding using electricity and dealing with a colder house or dealing with other sort of inconveniences when you're paying, and it's not that you're paying too little, you're paying the true cost. So I don't think I would agree that this is a regressive approach if my understanding is right, that lower income people within the district actually are using more electricity because they live there full time.
Okay, I want to be sure that the public.
Let me say one other thing. This change in the time of use, and we didn't actually dig deeply into this, but I think it is a worthwhile thing to think about, whether there, and in general, would the system run into other constraints, whether it's the circuit level constraints the transmission line constraint or whatever when you went to this pricing. If it would, and I think the answer is there's no real sign of other constraints it would hit. But if it would, then I think there is an argument for time varying pricing in order to accommodate that. But, you know, I've done a lot of work on time varying pricing, and I can tell you that it isn't the fundamental problem with your price structure if you're charging 65 cents a kilowatt hour when the true avoided cost is less than 20% of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just want to say that we should look at all the avenue before moving in one direction, and clearly the impact on the distribution system should be assessed. The impact on the greenhouse gas should be assessed, and the energy efficiency. How can we couple basically energy efficiency measures, which we are mandated to do, by the way, with the electrical rate structure? So all that should be taken in consideration. So, and I think it's going to take some time to assess all these things. And I thank you for your time.
Thanks, Bertrand. Preston.
Great, thank you. So I definitely agree. This is a great analysis, and I'm glad to see this move forward. I'm going to start with a question. I believe the professor had mentioned that, if I heard correctly, PG&E is approximately 70% carbon-free with their energy electric mix. Good, head nodding. Have we done the calculation?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, that's right.
Okay, good. Have we done the calculation for the PUD? What is our percent carbon-free?
Yeah, that's a hard calculation to do because you're buying a lot of unspecified power, right? Isn't that right, Bob? And yes. So you can't, there isn't a contract path in the same way that PG&E does. And so I don't know what that number is.
Can we assume that it's demonstrably less than 70%?
I don't know we can say something about the mix on the system so the district is part of CAISO, right?
Yes.
Purchases through.
So we could do a calculation for the CAISO system. And CAISO, I'm on the board. I should know this number off the top of my head, but I don't. But yeah, it is probably lower. It's probably not a huge amount lower as sort of an average of the whole system, but I'm not sure what that number is.
May I request that the board determine what that number is and publish it?
Well, we don't have any way of knowing. In addition, it's highly variable. On a good weather year, then you have the northwest water flow, and then you're getting all the hydro. On a drought year, you don't get it all. So it's a large variation. I mean, the short answer, Preston, is we can buy as much renewables as we want. If we wanted to be 100% renewable, it would cost 0.8 cents more per kilowatt hour.
So let's have that discussion for a minute, because I think this is, for me, philosophically, the biggest issue, in addition to the inefficiency or efficiency question that I think this rate. It is, though, the case that the 13 cents avoided cost is not a full economic or greenhouse gas. There's no greenhouse gas, externality cost in that pricing.
No, there is.
13 cents.
Well, there's
13.7 cents. Yeah.
I'm sorry. The existing REC costs are in the 13 cents. Is that what you're saying?
The existing REC cost, and we modeled what it would look like to include the social cost of carbon. And as Severin pointed out, that's not dissimilar from our variable costs our non-variable costs that we're putting in, the non-additionality. The way we've come up with 13 cents includes some things that you could argue don't vary with purchasing, but they also approximate the $50 social cost of carbon. So I feel like we're pretty close.
Okay.
But Preston, let me say, I have done modeling of California and the West and the full social cost of power in both situations. And both of them are below 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So I'm pretty sure that this number is overstating, but I would have to, as I'm looking at this, it would depend in part on how big that O&M component that's really marginal is.
Okay, good. Well, that's a positive thing to hear. Thank you for identifying that. That is not something that to the layman would be obvious, that 13 cents also includes a full social cost. So I think
so we've done this for all of the larger utilities. I don't think Kirkwood Meadows was one of the ones in our data set. And for the big three, the big five in California, including SMUD and LADWP, it's all under 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
Okay. So that would be a good thing to include in that letter, the draft that I reviewed the other day, Bob. So I think that's a critical point, and it gets to kind of where I was headed.
Provide those data.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Because where I was headed was basically a philosophical discussion, or point of view, I'll call it. As a ski resort, most of our residents are actually part-time here and have homes elsewhere. Many, probably the majority, vast majority, in other areas of California, where they're part of the IOU system, paying PG&E, SoCal Edison, whatever it may be. So while I see there being a very valid reason to adopt the new rates, or excuse me, a change that goes to a higher base, but a lower, volumetric pricing, that all makes good sense. It helps with electrification, helps pay out, make a more predictable revenue stream for financing, et cetera. The piece where I find it incongruous, without the data point that you were just provided, Professor, which I appreciate, it seems to me that we ought to be not only leading on the cost side, but philosophically, and I think our customers probably could buy into this as well, because this is a ski resort, I think we ought to be leading in some other dimension as well. Specifically, we should be leading in electrification. We should be leading in efficiency. We should be leading in reduced greenhouse gas reduction. Whatever, pick your poison. But in some form, I don't think it's tenable as a ski resort specifically for high net worth, people. Let's be honest, this is not a low income community, other than perhaps, a few people that work here. But in general, the vast population here is in the higher income wealth. It makes no sense to me. It's incongruous that we would not lead only on cost, but we would also not at least be at peer level to the other IOUs in the area, but preferably even ahead of them as a ski resort. Good branding, good messaging on greenhouse gas reduction. So that's where I think that to me, the 13 cents feels like we're swinging too far in the other direction, and that we have an umbrella, if you will, a pricing umbrella as it relates to our peer institutions. And I don't think daytime energy and PG&E, for instance, is 13 cents. I know as a fact it's not. And I just feel like that feels philosophically beyond where we need to be. And if we had the opportunity to be slightly higher and perhaps even increase revenues in a phased-in fashion, I think it's fine. But to make our energy mix cleaner, more towards the 70%, more towards 100%, to be honest, as a ski area, philosophically, that feels like the right direction to be moving. And so I'll stop there. I could go on.
So the study we put out in February actually addresses PG&E, and you're right, their retail prices are above 13 cents. But actually what our study says is that's a real problem, that we aren't reflecting the true marginal cost for PG&E. And as a result, we are discouraging electrification and imposing a pretty regressive tax, because essentially what we're doing is there's this marginal cost, fuel, the electricity, greenhouse gases, and then there's all this other stuff. And this other stuff is climate change mitigation and adaptation. So when you cut trees around the transmission lines, that's something you got to do, but that's not a marginal cost. It doesn't vary with how much electricity you consume. Subsidies for rooftop solar, net metering is a cost shift, and that's in there. Subsidies for low income, the CARE programs get paid out of other people's bills. All of those things are in the price, but they're not actually the marginal cost of consuming electricity.
Sure.
So it's important to recognize that PG&E's rates are very distorted and really quite regressive.
And they could be the other end of the spectrum. I don't disagree with that, but I think that their rates are more in the, their rates are well into the 20s and even the 30 cents at peak times. So I think you had said earlier, for instance, that the 13 cents, could be lower, but you also said that perhaps even a number into the 20-cent range, could be defensible for the utility here for the district. And
well,
I guess
it would
what I'm
be a huge improvement over where you are now.
Exactly. And so what I'm proposing is that we actually take a leadership position as a ski resort, as a group that has customers who not only have a meter here, but have a meter at whatever, mostly IOU, where they are already with their primary residence, that we actually take a leadership role rather than simply go to the lowest possible point, that we actually pick something higher, be a little bit more aggressive and forward thinking, and try to drive down our emissions mix. And I think we can prescribe what that can be, as opposed to saying we don't know what it is because it varies, et cetera, which is understandable. We could actually be proactive and set a target and price in such fashion that that was actually done in a reasonably, cost neutral fashion. For customers. Point of view.
Let me just say two things. One is you can buy 100% green power, and there are utilities that do, but I don't want you to get the impression that you're actually consuming 100% green power.
Understood. And I didn't suggest 100%. It's all a range of options.
You're just offsetting. And so it's not that when you consume a little more power, it's necessarily that much more green power ramping up at that moment.
Yeah.
The other thing is, in another study I'm doing, which won't be out for another month or so, we're looking at the incentives to shift to electric space heating, electric water heating, and EVs, and electric dryers. And it really makes a difference. Forget about Kirkwood Meadows, just PG&E. Going from the PG&E rates to the real social marginal cost, including pollution, makes a huge difference in the attractiveness of going to electric hot water heating, electric space heating, both of which are sort of close in the money at social marginal cost and are not in the money. Well, there's some disagreements about how efficient heat pumps are, but and EVs. I will.
What about solar? So I agree with what you said. I'm actually in the throes of that process right now in electric heat pumps, air sourced, high altitude efficient heat pumps. So I'm looking at that right at the moment. This makes it hugely attractive. But what does it do for rooftop solar at 13 cents?
Well, rooftop solar becomes less attractive at 13 cents because, but rooftop solar is a very expensive way to acquire renewable power. It is far, far more expensive than grid scale renewables. So rooftop solar, the incentive in California for rooftop solar is primarily a cost shift. That is, what you are actually saving the system is far lower, it's our social marginal cost, than what you're actually saving privately. So when my friends ask me about should they install rooftop solar, I say, look, if you want to do it for an environment, that's great, but you're going to be imposing these costs on people. My friends are also relatively wealthy, mostly, on people who are poorer than you are. So if you're going to do that, you should take those savings and put them towards helping people who are now going to be burdened with higher electricity prices. And so, yes, I think charging a price that reflects the true cost means that people have less incentive to make their own electricity. But that's because you're actually showing them what the true savings they're.
I think that's correct economically. I think that in greenhouse gas, if we went back to my earlier point that we actually went to an appropriately high mix of carbon-free energy, then I agree with that point, both economically, but then also societally. And I think if we're having an unnecessarily high contribution greenhouse gas through the utility electric bill, and I know nobody's able to quantify that just now, then I think then those two things should be in balance. And I think it's up to the utility and the leadership of this group to actually provide that balance between societal and economic benefit.
we have done that calculation for the biggest utilities in CAISO. And those, even counting greenhouse gases at $50 a ton. And by the way, even if you went to $100 a ton, you're going to raise it by about 2 cents, because no, less than that. Sorry, 1 cent. Right. So it's not going to make a big difference. And so the number you will get is going to be in the 8, 9, 10 cent if you're up at $100 a ton.
John Schroeder, thanks, Preston. John, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Thanks for helping with our district and attending today and providing a lot of insight. Quick question is, what do you think a reasonable charge is on a monthly basis for just providing access to this type of an electrical connection? You know, what do you think a minimum base charge should be just for the right to have access? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and in some ways you're now moving out of the realm of economics and into the realm of sort of social justice and equity. So the district's problem is there is this small amount of the costs that are actually the cost of providing power, and this big chunk of costs that are costs that everybody's benefiting from. They're not benefiting equally, but everybody's benefiting, and we're not sure how much they're benefiting. It's not strictly proportional to the number of kilowatt hours you use, because some people are getting huge value out of their kilowatt hours and other people are doing things that are pretty marginal. So, I mean, there are many concepts of equity. And when we start talking about dividing up costs that are really joint costs, it's sort of, you think of it as national defense or bridges that everybody drives over and you wouldn't want to have a toll booth on all the time. How do you divide up those costs? And there's the concept of ability to pay. And we do that a lot with progressive income taxation. And we pay for a lot of public goods that way. There's the concept of share of benefits, even if it's not sort of imposing costs, it's differentially, there are different benefits. And that's really attractive, except it's very hard to see what they are. So looking at the numbers in this case, a flat monthly charge, if you just divided the, I'm not gonna be able to do the numbers off the top of my head, but it would work out to, Bob probably can tell you what it would work out to if everybody just had a flat monthly, if all the residential did. There is apparently a problem with that because that would treat the ski resort differently, and there's some legal constraint on that. So I don't have a good answer for you of what the right price is. What I do know is that this proposal would keep most people at pretty much the same bill as they were before, plus or minus 10 or 20%. And then it would lower their cost drastically if they decided to consume more electricity. And I know that rubs people the wrong, some people the wrong way, but I think that's a huge good thing because they'd still be paying the cost they're imposing, including the greenhouse gases, including all the pollution, but they'd have an incentive to switch from propane and from wood, and they would have an incentive to just use electricity in ways that benefit them, including things like, and I know somebody mentioned this in some email, I think, heater, roof strips or whatever they're called.
Snow melt.
To avoid ice dams. And I have friends in Colorado who use that, and it's, you know, a huge benefit to them. And at 60 cents a kilowatt hour, I suspect there are many people who are avoiding using that who would really benefit from being able to consume more electricity at a cost where they're really covering their additional cost. Sorry, John, that wasn't a good answer, but.
John, the answer to your question, if you took our fixed costs and divided equally from every meter, it'd be $5,000 a year.
Yeah, I guess what I was what I was kind of getting at is, if you had a half acre of land and you didn't have access to electrical connection, it would be worth a fraction of what it would when you can provide those utilities. So there is just a core value of having that service available.
Oh yeah.
Whether you use it or not. I mean, if you have an empty lot at Kirkwood, your lot's worth more than if you didn't have access to that.
Absolutely.
And so that connection and the ability to have that connection has an inherent value of something. And I think it's higher than what we charge today.
Oh, it's absolutely. I think that somebody talked about not being able to exit the system, but the fact is, going off grid, I have friends who live off grid who say, it requires constant focus on your electricity, your energy consumption, because things that very few people are willing to do, and frankly, very few upper income people are willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Are there?
Peter had a question.
Yeah, Peter. You're on mute, Peter. You're on mute.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, very good.
So has any thought been given to instituting standby charges on undeveloped property to help pay down the debt? I mean, yeah, our predecessor did this to pay for the treatment plant, EID. I remember when I bought my first piece of property in 1984, I had to pay an annual standby charge. That way, future owners are paying for the hookup, the grid, instead of all of us current owners having to pay for the grid, because it raises their property values, and it would encourage people to actually build houses rather than, or sell their property rather than just sitting on it. Is that legal? Could that be considered?
I can tell you that Amador Water Agency does that on some water and wastewater systems. I'm not sure, I would assume it would translate to electric.
Okay, I'm just curious if that, because that's our burden, is to pay for the out valley. That's why we can't go with avoided costs, because we have this huge debt. If we could pay that debt down, it seems to me that would benefit everyone.
That's an interesting concept. You can think of sort of the equity aspect of it, that if you start paying down the debt and then somebody builds a house 10 years from now when the debt is substantially lower, but still has use of the transmission line, you could argue that's not paying their share. They could argue that, yeah, but we weren't using it all this time.
Right.
But yeah, I don't really have more to contribute. Maybe Bob has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing, Peter. I don't know if you remember,
sure,
but back when we were first connected to the grid, and I actually developed a kind of scheme like that and presented it to the board. And the board was, in the end, favorable, but our attorney said wasn't a good idea, so we backed off, unfortunately, in my opinion. But I think it's very interesting thought, Peter.
Was that Dick Shanahan?
Yeah,
said that.
Yeah,
that it'd be highly contested.
Well, the way I was doing it, it was. I mean, yes, it could be contested because it was an unusual thing to do for our situation. But I think if it were simpler than what I was proposing, maybe it's a good idea. Howard has another question, and then I'd like to circle back around to anybody who was talking, and I asked to be briefer if they have anything else to say. Go ahead, Howard.
So this is really a question for the staff and the board, and that is, we have two large lots that have undeveloped foundations that have been there for years. If you did something like you're proposing, or you mentioned, Eric, previously, this idea of charging for standby, are those lots paying anything now? And would this in fact put any cost on this? Then would put some cost on them, because I would be totally in favor of doing whatever we could to encourage those lots to be developed. and charging them appropriately for the standby that they've had available to them just seems to be fair and equitable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to go off my prior experience with Amador Water, since they did do it. So they did have standby fees for certain. When I started there, they had 27 different systems. They've since narrowed it down to 2. But originally they did have standby fees. What that does, though, is reduce the connection fees when they do come in. So, you know, that would be the only give on that. But right now, to the best of my knowledge, no, they're not paying anything, the 2 you mentioned.
Let's see, Reed, did you get your questions? And what I'm trying to avoid is long position statements here. You know, this is sort of questions for
I'll be brief.
Okay.
So one thing I just wanted to clarify is that when Bertrand used the term regressive, and certainly when I use the term regressive, I wasn't referring to people less well off in the valley, but I think, which is what Dr. Bornstein was saying, it really had to do with it. It didn't encourage efficiency, and it really encouraged consumption. And so I think, well, that's what I meant when I said regressive. And a lot of the cases that Dr. Bornstein has talked about actually does increase, would encourage the increase of consumption of electricity. And just with this, it just seems like this whole how to handle it. And I really appreciate what Preston said. And there's so much about, you know, avoided costs. But I really think that this is something that is a bigger can of worms than maybe was originally contemplated, and would take time to take a bit and get it right. Because how do you have fair pricing, for example? Do you base it on prior consumption, square footage, And I think if you decide to go this way, really there should be a phase in, and I'm very concerned about unintended consequences.
Thanks, Reed. Bertrand, did you have something more you wanted to say at this point?
I'll just say one thing that, you know, and I would encourage a more detailed study of avoided costs, but I'm pretty certain you will come up with a number that is within a couple of cents of the number that Bob came up with. I would guess a little lower, but it certainly is not going to be 20 cents.
Bertrand, did you have anything more for Severin that you'd like to?
My main point is this is a very complex change that we are entertaining here, and I think there is a consensus that we should do that, reduce significantly the kilowatt hour rate. My concern is the implementation and taking the time to do it right, so we don't have to revisit that in the near future. And distribution-wise, and equitability, and all these things, and energy efficiency. And I think pairing the 2 together would actually, it's now that we need to think about that. So that's my recommendation here.
Okay, thanks. Is there anyone else with a question for Severin?
Eric, I just want to comment on one thing that Preston brought up. So for 2 years, as you know, we've offered the option of being 100% renewable, meaning that we buy RECs for 100%. And the cost is marginal, it's 1%. So for most homes, it'd be an extra $35 a year or so, and they'd be at 100% because, you know, renewables are quite inexpensive currently in California. The uptake has been quite marginal. And when we've done surveys on this, the feedback has been, it's so expensive already, I don't want to spend any extra money. And this is going from 66 cents to 66.8 cents, right? I mean, actually, it's a little bit different there. So I think we've heard from the community that even an optional 100% renewable isn't a hot seller. We can still try to keep promoting it. But if we wanted to have a higher percentage of RECs, which means that, you know, we claimed And you know, there's one thing how electricity flows through the system. There's another who's claiming the energy, the green energy. Buying the RECs, we're claiming it. That's really energy that happened. And so if we wanted to be higher than what's required by law, it's a rounding error in the usage rates. I'd just like Severin to comment on when you buy a REC. Yes, you don't know what's being delivered, but you have claimed your share of the renewables in California. We only do tier 1. So can you comment on what it means when we buy a REC?
Yeah, and RECs have really evolved over the years, and there was some REC washing early on.
Right.
But I think that they are now much more reliably going towards paying for the additional cost of renewables. They're very cheap because renewables are very cheap these days. And so in some sense, I think a long time ago, there was, and I wrote about it, there was some real questions about whether they were legit. But now, in some sense, for the cost of renewables is so close that there's no incentive really to game it the way people used to. Long-term contracts are another way to do it directly with renewables. Probably for a district this small, that doesn't really, it's logistically not very workable. But I think RECs make sense.
I have a question.
Oh, let me just add one thing to that. And another way to do it, of course, is to actually, for the propane, as we talked about, and for the stuff not covered by RECs, is to buy greenhouse gas certificates from the cap and trade market and retire them. They're not priced correctly, in my opinion. They're too low. They're only $18 or something, right. But you could buy double.
And we do offer that for propane if people want to do that.
Bertrand?
Yes, my question is it's for solar, and basically what is your estimate of the cost of using grid as a storage system for solar user? I know that actually the grid is available to everyone, including the district, which actually has electricity on demand, and that's because of the grid capabilities to do that. So the question is, how much does it cost for the utilities to offer that storage abilities for the net metering, basically, and for solar customer, and where does you think it's going to end up next year when we get NEM 3?
Yeah, so so first of all, although it is attractive to think about it as storage, what you're really doing is you're exporting power to the grid when you want to, and you're importing power from the grid when you want to. And right now, under net energy metering, you get to do it at the same price. I think that will change under the new regime that they're now discussing. I'm not sure how much. I'm pretty sure they won't go to where I want them to go, which is you can keep NEM, but price electricity at its true avoided cost. And then NEM is just the same as participating in the market. I would say that, the value of power exported from solar right now, from rooftop solar, in most cases is on the order of 7 or 8 cents. And they're getting paid on the order of 28 cents. For the super users, more than that. So there's a pretty big gap there. I wouldn't call that the cost of storage, but I would call it the cost imposed on the system through this net metering arrangement. And, net metering was started early on. We didn't have meters that could do anything else. All they could do was tell you the net. And rooftop solar was this nascent industry that nobody thought was going to turn into much, or most people didn't. And that's completely changed. And at the same time, retail rates in California have skyrocketed, making it much more attractive privately to put in solar. But the problem is the avoided cost for the system is still pretty low. And so you're mostly avoiding paying your share of the climate change mitigation and adaptation, subsidies for low income customers, et cetera.
So I just want to follow up on that because Bertrand and Pamela and I have had kind of a lively email exchange on this topic. And one question I have for you is if our usage rate and our avoided cost rate are the same, then we should be relatively neutral in terms of whether customers do solar or not as a district.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, yeah, rooftop solar, if you're compensating it at its true value, it's fine if people put it in. On the other hand, they can also get very green power from the grid. But if they really, I mean, there are other reasons to have rooftop solar, particularly if you're willing to spring for the batteries on site too. And if you're subject to public safety power shutoffs or just distribution line failures, then, you know, it might make sense for resilience. But from a pure contribution to the sort of social welfare, the common good, if we're charging the true avoided cost, I think that's, people should do it if they want. I suspect very few people will do it at that price, but I may be wrong on that.
I guess the point would be is, as a district right now, if a large customer, large meaning, you know, several 100,000 kilowatt hours a year, decided to put on solar and match their usage, that their contribution to the fixed costs would, under the current scheme, would go to zero, and we'd be damaged by it, and we wouldn't be on the same side as the solar customer. Whereas making it the avoided cost, we're neutral. If they want to do it, fine, and if they don't, fine as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that's one of the things I have said for the IOUs, which is it would just end this tension that, you know, that the IOUs feel threatened by it, because the compensation would match the value brought to the system.
Okay. Reed, one last question.
Yeah, just real quick. It's, I mean, so there's an example of going to a lower marginal cost, matching with avoided cost, where it would discourage solar, which on the overall is generally considered a good thing. And I mean, to have solar, and what I was surprised to learn is a few days ago is that it was possible to buy RECs, you know, as a customer of the district. And I think that the district could maybe do a better job of getting that information out there, and then really get serious about encouraging people to work on energy efficiency. I just think
Reed, if you have an idea about how to make the renewables more visible, I mean, we've sent individual letters to every single household. We've done it multiple times. We've done a survey. So if you have a suggestion of how to make it more visible, as the communications committee head, I'd love to make that happen.
Bob, if I could just comment on that, I think to Reed's point, by lowering the volumetric pricing, that's the time that you're going to get people to buy into the REC program. I think the REC program as it currently exists today at 67 cents, plus on top of that, paying to have clean energy just doesn't work. But if you go to the 13 cents, or, you know, I still propose that a 20 cents, something more on the peer of our IOU neighbors, with the caveat that, you know, Dr. Bornstein spoke about the, you know, they're too high, PG&E being too high. I could certainly acknowledge that. But if we went to a lower price, I think it's time to reinvigorate the marketing around the REC program. And that will have much higher uptake.
Yeah, my thought on that, Preston, and somebody tell me if I'm wrong, because I've asked in the past, as Brandy knows, what would it take to be 100% renewable mix through the provider that we buy our power through? And I think it's been pennies.
Yeah.
Bob has said it's less than a penny.
Really?
We've been reluctant to do it because our rates are so high. And we've been trying to drop the rates slowly.
Yeah.
rather than increase it. If we're down at 14 cents.
So could we go to 14 cents at 100% instead of 13% at whatever it is we're at today? That'd be awesome.
We could do it at 14.5 cents. We could be 100%.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the way to do it. I mean, that's the way to do it rather than have people spend thousands of dollars on a roof solar system unless they really want to.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think that, you know, don't think of this as discouraging rooftop solar. Think of it as encouraging the most efficient, effective type of solar.
Well, it does discourage solar, but if we did that approach, I'm all in for that.
Discourage rooftop solar.
Pamela?
Let me just say one other thing, and then I know we're finishing up and I do have to go too. Rooftop solar has another big drawback, which is it produces whenever it wants, and it is completely opaque to the grid operator, which, as we're running into more grid volatility, is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Grid operator doesn't know what is coming off of there. All they see is the net coming out of the houses, and the grid operator can't curtail it, which they do sometimes have to do.
But it's highly predictable. I'm not sure how you say it's opaque, but that's a separate.
Okay, happy to follow up on that.
Highly predictable. So I don't think that equates to opaque, but you're probably making a different point. But back to the thing, I would love to see us go to, even if it's not 100%, at an extra penny. So we're reducing rates. We're going to that. That's nirvana in my book.
Great. Thank you, President. Pamela.
Hi, everyone. We're up on Dangberg, and we're newer owners, 2017, and this has been a really, really helpful discussion. One question for Dr. Bornstein. Well, first, let me say that we would absolutely steer toward join happily with the REC program if this overall change is made. So that, as everybody's commented, that becomes very attractive. We'd very much like to do that. A question for Dr. Bornstein: comparatively across California, looking at all the utility districts, how many other utility districts, large or small, have a model similar to what we're proposing going to?
Nobody has a model as that balance that you're proposing, but nobody else has fixed costs as nearly a high share as you have, because basically you're in a very unusual situation. A lot of the munis have fixed charges. SMUDS is now $22 a month. I forget what the others are. SMUDS has been one of the leaders on this, and with very much the same idea. And the munis also tend to have much lower volumetric prices than the IOUs. Now that's partially because some of them made a whole bunch of money during the California electricity crisis, LADWP, and they've been able to pay off a lot of their debt. So, you know, this would bring the prices sort of in line with other munis, though lower than IOUs.
Is there, so for any district that's done anything even similar, is there anything we can learn in terms of, you know, trying to anticipate unexpected issues so that we can really shorten our time to roll into a decision like this and enact it?
I don't think any utility has done it in this direction. What SMUD has done is they've raised their fixed charge rather than raising their volumetric. So they haven't started from a high volumetric and then lowered it substantially, which is what you would be doing. But I will ask around and see if I can learn more.
Great, thank you.
But if we have the opportunity to set an example and prove that it works. Yeah. And in our particular case, we have this problem that we can't artificially make propane charges higher. That's unfair to the propane customers. We've decided we're going to raise more money from that. You know, as a public entity, we've charged our actual costs. So, and I think the real problem is the fact that we've said, here's electricity, it's so expensive, you probably wish you could use instead of propane, but we're going to price it and make sure you don't. That's where we are. That's where we are right now, and it's just a lose-lose situation.
Peter, did you have your hand up, or were you doing something?
No, it's just scratching what's left on my head.
Okay, well, Severin, thanks so much.
Happy to join you. Thanks for inviting me.
Extremely helpful.
Yeah, very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Good luck. And let me know if you'd like me to join again.
Thank you, Severin.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.